Universal Studios is the oldest surviving film company that is still in operation in Hollywood today. Founded in 1912, the company started out as a small independent company with great ambition. In 1915, they opened their doors to the nation, allowing the public to visit and be given a first-hand look at the work that brought movies to life. But it wouldn't be until 1923 when Universal would get their first big hit with The Hunchback of Notre Dame starring Lon Chaney Sr. They followed up their success with Chaney again in 1925 with Phantom of the Opera. These movies were just a taste of what was to come for Universal Pictures' legacy. One of the first to notice these signs was Julius Laemmle, also known as Carl Laemmle Jr., the son of Universal co-founder Carl Laemmle Sr. In 1929, for his son's 21st birthday, Laemmle Sr. gave him the position of head of Universal Production. Ultimately, Carl Jr. would develop a reputation that many people who knew him would describe as idiotic. However, the beginning of his tenure actually did get off to a promising start. A year after his promotion, Jr. produced the 1930 war epic All Quiet on the Western Front, the very first Universal film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. After the movie's success, Jr. wanted to look into the possibility of expanding on the popularity of the monster movies that Hunchback and Phantom had spawned. Despite his father's skepticism, Jr. set his eyes on Bram Stoker's classic novel, Dracula. He got in contact with Bram Stoker's widow, Florence Balcombe, and offered her a reported sum of $40,000 for the rights to her husband's novel. Today, that offer adds up to just over $7,500,000. Balcombe enthusiastically agreed, partially because the money would help her financially, but mostly because for the last few years she had been in a constant legal battle with a German film called Nosferatu. The film was a straight ripoff of Dracula. The filmmakers just changed the names of the characters to try and avoid a lawsuit. By 1925, the court had ruled in Balcombe's favor and had ordered all copies of Nosferatu be destroyed. But by that point, copies of the film had spread too far and wide to contain the momentum. So Balcombe decided that the best way to stop people from seeing Nosferatu was if there was an option for a better film adaptation of her husband's novel out there to overshadow it. But casting for the role of Dracula turned out to be harder than expected. According to the book Hollywood Gothic, David J. Scull explained that several actors were considered. The most commonly known actor was Lon Chaney. After his involvement in both Hunchback and Phantom, he did seem like the logical choice. However, Chaney had become diagnosed with throat cancer and had left the industry to die in peace at home at the age of 47. Universal's next choice was a German actor named Conrad Veidt, who had made his breakthrough with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1921 and had just wrapped up filming on a movie with Universal called The Man Who Laughs. Veidt was said to have turned the offer down because he feared that his English wasn't good enough for talkies yet. Another consideration was John Ray, fresh off the success of his performance in All Quiet on the Western Front. But then, one day, a touring company arrived in Los Angeles that was putting on a stage production of Dracula. In the title role was an unknown actor from Hungary named Bela Lugosi. Born Bela Ferenc Desoblasco in 1882, Lugosi began acting on the Hungary stage at the age of 20, shortly after his father's death. He took the stage name of Lugosi in honor of his hometown of Lugos. After serving in World War I, Lugosi began taking roles in silent Hungarian films and was heavily active in the Hungarian Communist Party. Finally, in 1919, he fled his homeland after the fall of the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic. His travels eventually led him to New York City, where he would eventually land the role of Dracula on the Broadway stage in 1927. Now, on the West Coast, Lugosi caught wind of Universal's interest in making a film adaptation of Dracula and offered his talent for the project. Despite praise for his performance in the stage production, Universal executives were skeptical. But they finally agreed when Lugosi accepted a salary of $500 a week, which was an insulting amount of money even back then, especially when co-star David Manners as Jonathan Harker was receiving $2,000 a week. But that's how determined Lugosi was to play this character. Two more actors from Lugosi's stage production were cast in the film as well, Edward Van Sloan as Van Helsing, and Herbert Bunston as Dr. Seward. Universal originally wanted to do a loyal adaptation of the original novel. However, when the stock market crashed leading America into the Great Depression, film studios had to cut down on their budgets to their movies. So Universal decided to adapt the Dracula stage play instead. The movie starts off normal. A solicitor from England arrives in Transylvania to meet with Count Dracula on a business matter. Only this time the solicitor is Renfield instead of Jonathan Harker. Dracula corrupts Renfield and uses him as a pawn once they get to London to get close to Dr. Seward, specifically his daughter Mina, played by Helen Chandler. This is where the stage play takes over. When mysterious attacks begin to occur around the city, Dr. Seward calls in an old friend and colleague, Dr. Van Helsing, for assistance. Van Helsing's knowledge of the supernatural makes him a formidable foe for Dracula as the two of them fight over Mina's soul. So how does the movie hold up today? Well, it's complicated. Let's start with the good. Hands down, the best part of the whole movie is Lugosi's performance as Dracula. From frame one, his mesmerizing gaze just draws people's attention to him whenever he's on screen. There is no doubt in my mind that he alone is this movie's saving grace. Even this entrance, when Harker and Van Helsing are studying the vampire bite on Mina's neck, is executed very well.
What could have caused them, Professor?
Count Dracula.
Aside from Lugosi, the most memorable performer in the movie is Dwight Frye as Renfield. His acting is so over the top that, while I'm sure it was shocking for people in 1931, today it actually comes off as hilarious. Especially when you compare him with his caretaker, Martin, played by Charles K. Gerard. If you switched out these characters for Michael Palin and Eric Idle, you'd have the makings of a Monty Python sketch. As for the movie itself, it starts off, honestly, pretty great. I love the gothic atmosphere of Transylvania, and the suspenseful silence between Dracula and Renfield before he went insane really works. Of course, this was because Hollywood was still trying to get used to the new audio technology at the time, but still, the lack of music playing underneath just makes the scene all the more eerie. Speaking of the music, the Swan Lake theme that plays underneath the title sequence really helps to set the tone of the film as well. Now, today, I cannot listen to Swan Lake without thinking of this movie. So what are my issues? Well, to start off, most of the characters aside from Renfield and Dracula come off as sort of bland. Most of them are very forgettable. But my main problem is the story. At times, it feels very sloppy. Because of the Great Depression, the studio wanted to get the movie out as quickly as possible so they could start making their money back. This gave the movie a limited time to shoot, resulting in a rush production and scenes from the script getting cut, causing various plot holes. Why are Jonathan Harker and Van Helsing suddenly in a cemetery when they spot Renfield escaping? Why does Van Helsing stay behind at the end of the film telling Mina and Harker to go on ahead? The movie doesn't give us these explanations. It's made even worse by the fact that there is another movie out there to compare it to. Yeah, fans were waiting for me to get to this part. While Lugosi's version was being filmed, there was another version of the exact same movie being shot at the same time, but in Spanish. And interestingly enough, the idea of filming English and Spanish versions of films simultaneously all started with a true love story. In 1928, a young Mexican girl with her grandmother arrived in Hollywood to pursue an acting career. Her name was Guadalupe Natalia Tovar Sullivan, but film historians remember her under the stage name Lupita Tovar. However, the timing wasn't great. Tovar and her grandmother had arrived in Hollywood just as the industry was transferring from silent films to talkies. She was able to get bit parts here and there, including in a film directed by John Ford. But overall, with no professional experience and a thick Spanish accent, jobs were limited. Finally, a casting director suggested she look into the foreign department over at Universal. Tovar eventually found herself in the office of Universal producer Paul Kohner. When Kohner first laid eyes on Tovar, it was love at first sight. He was determined to get Tovar a job at the studio as fast as he could. Tovar worked in Universal's foreign department, dubbing her voice for English films targeted at Spanish audiences. She was paid $15 per night for 3 nights a week. It was steady work, but it still wasn't enough to make rent and take care of her grandmother at the same time. Finally, Tovar decided that it was best to return to Mexico and go back to school. According to Tovar, when she revealed this decision to Paul Kohner, he panicked. The thought of her going back to Mexico and never seeing her again didn't sit well with him. She recalled that he begged her to give him 24 hours to find something better for her. Kohner rushed to the office of his boss, Carl Laemmle, and suggested making Spanish versions of films that were being shot on the lot. Laemmle was concerned about the money, but Kohner argued that the productions would cost less than their English counterparts. The sets were already built, and there were plenty of Spanish-speaking actors working on the lot as extras. Laemmle finally agreed, and within 2 weeks, Kohner had Tovar starring in a Spanish version of the Universal film The Cat Creeps. And then finally, Dracula. So, how does the Spanish version hold up to the English version? Much better, actually. Since the higher-ups at Universal were more focused on the English version, the Spanish crew had more flexibility and time, giving them more creative freedom. The story is more polished. The scenes missing from the English version were filmed, which helps to fill in the random plot holes. Director George Melford took notes of the decisions that Todd Browning was making with the English version and took the time to make his version more interesting. Let's compare the two shots where Dracula awakens from his crate. The box was a little steep for the actors to climb out of, so the English version came up with the solution of having the camera pan to distract the audience with a wolf howl out the window, giving Lugosi time to step in and make it look like he climbed out of the coffin with ease. Now watch the Spanish. I don't know about you guys, but that is far more clever. Overall, the Spanish version overpowers the English version in almost every way, with the exception of one, Carlos Villarreal as Dracula. Seriously, the first time I watched the Spanish version and saw Villarreal in the title role, comparing him to Lugosi, no joke, there were times where I couldn't figure out if I was watching a straight adaptation or a Mel Brooks parody. It was actually distracting at times. In fact, my own father said that Villarreal reminded him a lot of Nicolas Cage. I shouldn't be too hard on Villarreal. After all, the standard for which Dracula would be remembered hadn't been solidified yet. But he just doesn't hold as hypnotizing a presence as Lugosi does. The way I see it, if Lugosi had been part of the Spanish production, then we would have the perfect Dracula movie of 1931. Instead, the spotlight stealer is Lupita Tovar herself, in the role of Ava, the Mina character. And in some of these scenes you can see why. Hollywood was a bit softer on censorship when it came to movies being released internationally, so the Spanish version of Dracula comes off a bit more risque. Tovar explained in a later interview that Hollywood had just assumed that Latin America would want something a little more sexual, which she argued wasn't the case at all. Nevertheless, she went along with it because she knew she didn't have the star power to object. As for the films themselves, the English Dracula became a box office smash, becoming Universal's most financially successful film of 1931 and beginning their monster franchise which would help the company survive the Great Depression. Many critics praised the movie as one of the best mystery thrillers of the day, especially Bela Lugosi's spellbinding performance. It is difficult to think of anybody who could quite match the performance in the vampire part as Bela Lugosi, even to the faint flavor of foreign speech that fits so neatly. For Lugosi, however, Dracula's success was both a blessing and a curse. The movie did make him a star, but it would ultimately result in him becoming typecast as sinister characters. There were a few exceptions, like The Black Cat, which featured the first of many pairings alongside his longtime screen rival Boris Karloff, and also playing the butler in the murder mystery comedy The Gorilla, starring the comedy team The Ritz Brothers. But for the most part, despite his best attempts, Lugosi was forced to play villains for the rest of his career. But ultimately, I don't think he ever really regretted playing the role that made him an icon. When Lugosi died in 1956, his wife and son requested that he be buried in his original Dracula cape, stating that Lugosi would have wanted it this way. Today, Lugosi is still well loved and admired among horror fans and movie buffs in general, and his portrayal of the iconic vampire has still never been surpassed.
Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make.
As for the Spanish Dracula, Universal saw the film as a financial flop. It was one of the final attempts from Hollywood to make films that would appeal to the foreign market. Before Lupita Tovar, starring in movies like The Cat Creeps and Dracula made her an international celebrity. Even though Hollywood thought nothing of their Spanish remakes, in the eyes of her home country, she had made it to the big times, receiving the nickname of the Sweetheart of Mexico. A year after the film was wrapped, Lupita Tovar and Paul Kohner married and settled down together. They had 2 children, including actress Susan Kohner, who would make a name for herself in Hollywood as well, even receiving an Oscar nomination for her performance in Imitation of Life. After marrying German-born novelist and designer John Weitz, Kohner left the spotlight to focus on her family. The pair had 2 sons who are still working in the Hollywood industry today, Paul and Chris Weitz, the filmmakers behind movies such as American Pie and About a Boy. Chris Weitz would even direct the second installment of the Twilight saga, New Moon, in 2008, and Paul Weitz would go on to direct Cirque du Freak, the vampire's assistant, in 2009. So I guess they're aiming to keep the topic of vampires in this family. But I'm sure Lupita Tovar was proud of her family's accomplishments over the years, up until her death in 2016 at the age of 106. Thankfully, she lived long enough to see her version of Dracula get the credit it long deserved. Today, the Spanish version is often seen as the superior version of the 1931 classic. And yes, I have to agree. While Villarreal's performance doesn't hold a candle to Lugosi's, the Spanish version was filmed with a lot more patience and, story-wise, does flow a lot better. It even answers the questions I had earlier on the plot holes from the English version. But like many old films from back in the day, a few scenes from the Spanish Dracula were cut because they were deemed as too gruesome or sexual for the time. The cut footage was believed to have been lost forever until it was discovered in Cuba. The footage was later restored to the printing, but it is much more worn and aged than the rest of the film. So, if you ever watch the movie and you suddenly see a clip where the celluloid doesn't look as polished, then you know you are watching a piece of the lost footage. In October of 2024, Mexico released a 7-episode comedy series on the making of the Spanish Dracula called, and pardon my Spanish here, Y Llegaron de Noche, translated in English as And They Arrived at Night. The series stars A.J. Vogie as Paul Kohner, Yare Santana as Lupita Tovar, and Eugenio Derbez as Carlos Villarreal, with guest stars like Daniel Raymond as Bela Lugosi and Jason Alexander as Carl Laemmle. Okay, that's great casting right there. And while this series isn't entirely accurate with its history, honestly very few adaptations are, this series is funny and charming. If you're curious, it is available on Amazon Prime and the Spanish streaming service ViX. Only the first episode is free, so you will need to pay for the rest. But it was an enjoyable watch, and I would definitely recommend it. So which one do I recommend more, the English or the Spanish Dracula? Well, obviously Bela Lugosi's performance can't be topped. So if you want the one with the iconic performance, then go for the English version. Just don't get your hopes up of much else living up to the expectations. If you want the movie with the better story and directing, then I would suggest the Spanish version. But whichever one you choose, there is no doubt that the 1931 Dracula films, overall, are perfect examples of classic cinema.